There is a woman who's a pastor, a writer, a speaker, by the name of Nadia Bolz-Weber. And maybe you know her, maybe you've heard her. She's been interviewed on a number of news shows. She was interviewed on NPR. She's really an amazing speaker and presenter because she has this gift for speaking very honestly and very cleanly and plainly about deep things of faith and about her own life of faith as well. And a great example of this was a response I heard her give to a question she was asked after a presentation. It was, a kind of a Q&A after she spoke. And a young man stood up and he asked Nadia Bolz-Weber, he said, "What do you do to find God?" He said, "Do you have something special? Do you set aside time each day for meditation and prayer? Or do you go on retreats?" He said, "What do you do to find God?" And Nadia Bolz-Weber said the most surprising thing, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase her, but what she said to the young man is this. She said, "I got to be honest, I don't do anything to find God." She said, "As a matter of fact, I spend most of my time hiding from him." She said, God just keeps showing up every once in a while, even though I really don't want him. She said, because he usually shows up, and what he wants is for me to do something that I don't usually do, or he wants me to be with people I don't usually spend time with. She said, it just makes me uncomfortable. She said, I like my life just the way it is, so I hide from God. But she said, God keeps showing up. That was her response. And of course, she was having some fun. She was joking something about this whole business of finding God. But I think she was also trying to put her finger on something that is a great truth. And that is that our God is a God who surprises us, who does unexpected things. That even when there are times when we're hiding, or we put up some kind of barrier to kind of limit God or keep God out, our God just somehow isn't content. God just keeps pushing and surprising, doing the unexpected. Now, that shouldn't surprise us to hear that or to hear her response, because after all, that's what the scriptures are full of. They're full of instances where God shows up uninvited into the lives of people. A perfect example would be that passage from Exodus that we heard this morning, in which we hear about the time God showed up in Moses' life. Just to remind you of some of the backstory, Moses was one of the people of Israel during the time they were captives to the Egyptians. Moses, in fact, had fled from Egypt because he had struck one of the Egyptian overseers. But he comes into the wilderness around Mount Sinai, and everything in his life kind of falls into place. Moses meets a young woman, marries. His father-in-law is prosperous. Moses becomes prosperous. He's got the kind of carefully constructed life that no doubt he wanted. And then all of a sudden there was that day that God showed up, when all of a sudden in front of him there was a burning bush, and God speaking to him out of it, and God asking him to do something that he had really no desire to do. Moses was asked by God to go back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh, bring the people of Israel out of their captivity and eventually to the promised land. Now, be clear, this doesn't happen because Moses is looking for God. As I said, he probably was more than content with the life that he had. But somehow that was God's nature, to surprise, to do the unexpected, to show up when he's least invited. Moses, of course, we hear, makes this clear to us because Moses objects. Moses comes up with every excuse he can to try to say, God, I'm not your man. I'm not the person that ought to be doing this. But God's not content. God has come because God needs Moses, And God will have Moses, no matter what Moses says. You see, that's why I say it ought not to surprise us. This is just one example. This is the nature of our God. Our God shows up even when he's not wanted or expected. God shows up and surprises people and asks them to do the unexpected. Now, we might well ask, well, why is this God's nature? Why does God do this? Why is God in the business of disturbing people's comfortable lives? And the easy answer is to say it's the one way God has to actually penetrate those lives and to break down some of the barriers that we maybe put up. It's one way that God has kind of to disturb people and get them to new places and new things that they may not have done. I'd go to our other lesson this morning, to the story of Zacchaeus. Maybe you know the story. Zacchaeus was a very wealthy man. He was a tax collector. He had that wealth because he defrauded other people. He would either skim money off the top of taxes, or he would misfigure the taxes so people paid more than they were supposed to, and he would pocket the extra. Again, that was who Zacchaeus was. And what we hear happened, of course, is that Jesus came to Jericho one day, and Zacchaeus just wanted to see him. He didn't want to meet him. He climbs a tree. It can be clear to us that he doesn't want to meet Jesus. He just wants to see him. And that's where Jesus does an unexpected thing. Walking along, Jesus stops and looks up and says to this man up in a tree, "I'm coming to your house this day." Now here's what's important for us about this. It's because he does that then Zacchaeus' life has changed. What we hear by the time the passage is in is that because Zacchaeus had met Jesus, he begins a whole new life. He promises to give half of what he has away to the poor. He's going to repay anybody who's misled 4 times of whatever it was that they overpaid. Again, he's changed drastically. And again, that's just an example of how it is that God disturbs people's lives because he would have no other way. Think about it. Think about what would happen if instead of surprising Zacchaeus and interrupting his sightseeing up in the tree, what if what if Jesus instead had sent one of his followers to go and visit Zacchaeus ahead of time and say, well, my master's coming to Jericho. He thinks it'd be a nice thing if you would give half of what you have away to the poor. What if that visitor had come and said, and by the way, also not only give away half you have, if you've defrauded anybody, pay them back 4 times. Do you think Zacchaeus would have said if he had had that kind of nice, neat meeting? He'd have said, thanks, but I think I'll pass this time. It's only because God intrudes. It's only because Jesus interrupts his life that then finally change can take place. See, what I'm trying to tell you today is that's why I think this is the nature of God. Because somehow so many of us anyway, we want to only let God in so much, and then after that, we want to put up our barriers. We like those nice, neat, comfortable lives that Nadia Bolz-Weber talked about. It's only because God intrudes that suddenly things are jumbled enough that God begins to have a place. You know, there's an old poem from the Victorian age in England, written by a poet by the name of T.E. Brown, in which he tries to talk about this need that God has to become a part of our lives. Let me warn you, the poem's written in very Victorian English, so you're gonna have to listen carefully. If you haven't been so far, you're gonna have to listen carefully here, because what the poet's going to do is going to make a comparison between us, our lives, and being like a shell on the ocean floor. So listen, he writes, if thou, meaning us, if thou could empty all thyself of self, like to a shell dishabited, then he might find thee on the ocean shelf and say, this is not dead, and fill thee with himself instead. But thou art all replete with very thou, and hast such shrewd activity, that when he comes, he says, this is enow unto itself. 'Twere better let it be. It is so small and so full, there is no room for me. It is so small and so full, there is no room for me. That's God speaking about what God finds so often in so many of our lives. They're so full that there is no place for what he really wants of us. That's why our God continually surprises us and comes to us in unexpected ways. One last thing. The point is that God is like this so that we might discover in ourselves and in our lives a richness and a fullness that we'd never have apart from God. Think of the two examples we had. Moses becomes a very courageous leader, a person of great wisdom, a power of speech, ability to lead people. He discovers all of that in himself because of God's gifts and because God has intruded into his life. Or take Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is one of those few people we have in the Bible that Jesus encountered that we actually have a name that's attached to him. Sometimes people speculate that we know his name because he became such a person of generosity that he was well known because of Jesus' unexpected entry in his life. See, what I'm trying to get at is what we are is not what we could be. That's why God keeps showing up, because God has a vision of what we might be. That's why the sermon today is really kind of a word of warning. Or better yet, you might say it's a heads up. That is, this God that you and I profess faith in will someday surprise us. And we should not be surprised when God does. You know, I was reminded of this because of an experience I had many years ago. I went to be the pastor of Peakland Church, which is in Lynchburg, Virginia. When I became the pastor of that church, they had a beautiful sanctuary, beautiful fellowship hall that they'd constructed 10 years before. But to my great surprise, when I got there, what I learned very quickly is though they had built these wonderful facilities 10 years before, on the day I arrived, the debt on those buildings was exactly the same as it had been the day they finished them. In other words, 10 years had gone by, and they had not been able to do anything except pay the interest on their debt. And now they had 10-year-old buildings. Well, that seemed a challenge enough until the day came that we discovered that the back driveway ran across the back of the church, that it had caved in. Caved in because the sewer line to the church ran underneath that driveway, and it had caved in and collapsed. And we discovered that it was going to cost about another $100,000 to repair all the damage and put in a new driveway and do those kinds of things. Well, the church's leaders did actually a pretty wise and courageous thing, because when they realized that they were going to have to pay for those kinds of repairs significantly, they said, well, why do we just want to raise $100,000? Why don't we go ahead and have a big capital campaign where we try to put a dent into the debt that our church has? And everybody realized that was kind of courageous and kind of a big step, but they said, let's go ahead and let's attempt that. And they also had the wisdom to say, but if we're going to do that, we better get some professional help. We better not try to just fundraise on our own. We better bring in somebody who's really good at this, because this is going to be a big ask. And they began to make plans to do that. Only what the church discovered is that to get a fundraiser in was going to cost them another $50,000 just to get started. And by this time, then, everybody was ready to throw up their hands in despair. What else could happen? And I remember the meeting we had, and this is why I'm telling you about all this, the meeting we had the night we learned that bad news about the cost of a fundraiser, and there was going to have to be up front. And everybody was wringing their hands and talking about, what more could happen to our church? We've been through so much. It just seems like things always are going wrong. And on and on and on, all that discussion went until there was finally one man, and his name was Frank Whitten. He had had enough, and he hopped to his feet. And Frank said, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of always going to meetings and getting discouraged. I'm always tired of all of us talking about how bad things are always happening to us. He said, this is a chance we have to kind of turn things around. And he said, we can't be stopped by $50,000. And Frank then went on and he said, I am so convinced this is what we're supposed to do that right now, tonight, I'm willing to write you a check for $1,000 to pay that fundraiser. Now, that's what Frank said. And then he went on and he pointed to the man sitting next to him, who was a man by the name of Don Roy. And he said, not only am I going to write you a check for $1,000 tonight, Don Roy is going to write you a check for $1,000 tonight. Now, I got to tell you, Don was a very quiet, thoughtful man. He was very calm, and sometimes in meetings you weren't really sure whether he was paying attention or not. But in that moment, you realized he was paying attention. Because the look that went across his face was like, what the heck? You just told me I'm going to give $1,000 tonight. And you could see a look of panic go across his face. But then there was that magic moment, that holy moment, when all of a sudden you saw Don realize he was being surprised. God was showing up in an unexpected way. And so he stood up and said, I agree with everything Frank just said. I'll also give you $1,000 tonight. And within a matter of another day, we had the $50,000. We went ahead and we were able to accomplish what we needed to accomplish. It was an amazing thing, all because of one surprising moment that came about in the middle of a meeting. I remember Don telling me a year later, after everything had done and we had made all the repairs and we'd put a significant dent in our debt, he said, that was one of those God moments. And he said, I'm just grateful I was listening. That's my warning in a way, or at least it's a heads up. Sooner or later in my life or in your life, we're going to get surprised. And our prayer ought to be always that we're listening, that we expect our God to do unexpected things, and we say, let's be a part of them. Amen.